Hi. I hate my makeup, but you know, whatever. I hate it so much. I hate it. Because it looks like garbage.
Well, you're not done yet, right?
I mean, I have to put eyelashes on, but I mean, I'm done with my eyeshadow. Oh well. Love you.
We do.
What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, why not subscribe? It's a good time around here and I'd sure love to have you back every week. In all seriousness, I appreciate the consistent support I see on the channel. It is so incredibly helpful when you guys comment on these videos and when you like them, and I cannot thank you enough. But if you're not interested in me or my content, that's fine. You know, it takes some people longer than others to refine their tastes. No, I'm totally kidding. I know that true crime interspersed with makeup is not for everyone, and that's why I always make sure to list some other creators down in the description box that have covered today's story in a way that perhaps you will enjoy. Before we hop into today's case, or cases, I want to give a very special thanks to Sarah for bringing these cases to my attention. Specifically, she requested that we cover the third case that I'm going to be talking about today, the case of Tammy Call. Tammy is actually Sarah's aunt, so she has a very personal connection to that case. It is a huge honor to be trusted with covering her aunt's story, so thank you again, Sarah, for requesting that I cover this case and for having the confidence in me to do so. And with all of that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so when I first started researching this case, I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into. Not only did it go from me researching one case to me researching 3 cases, but it was really weird because on one hand, it felt like there was so much information available, but on the other hand, it felt like there was so little. And unless you create content like this, that probably sounds really stupid. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that even though I went down every possible rabbit hole I could to try and find and gather as much information as I could about these cases, part of me still feels like I'm just missing so much. So if you happen to have any additional information, or perhaps anything that you know of that I did discuss, but you think needs additional information added to it or clarification, please do not hesitate to leave it down in the comments. All right, so the first story in our trilogy is going to be that of Karen Hill. Karen Sue Eats was born on January 30th, 1967 in eastern Iowa. She was one of 4 children raised by their single mother, Jessie McWilliams, and Karen actually was also the only girl in the family. So being surrounded by 3 brothers, it's no surprise that those who knew Karen as a child would frequently describe her as having been a tomboy. So much so that when she was forced to wear a dress to her 8th grade graduation, she insisted that at least she be allowed to wear blue jeans underneath it. She had absolutely no trouble keeping up with her brothers, and more importantly, she genuinely enjoyed doing so. She was incredibly athletic, she loved being outside, and she truly seemed to be afraid of nothing. And this trait came in especially handy when it came time for her to pack up her life and move 1,000 miles south to Leesville, Louisiana. Karen had married her high school sweetheart, James Hill, just after she'd graduated high school in 1985. So when James, who at the time was serving in the Army, got stationed at Fort Polk, they picked up and they headed south to begin their new life together. Fort Polk is located in Vernon Parish near Leesville in rural west central Louisiana. And this area is often referred to as the Crossroads, as it covers the center portion of the state, and it's sort of I guess, merges the cultures of northern and southern Louisiana. And Karen and James were more than happy to make this move, as long as they got to make it together. Like I said, they'd been high school sweethearts, and they'd known and loved each other for most of the key years of their lives. They wanted nothing more than to build a happy life together. They wanted to have a family, they wanted to grow old together. They had every intention of being together right up until their dying days. However, sadly, that would only be the case for one of them. Karen's ultimate professional goal was to someday become a veterinarian. She loved animals and she was incredibly passionate about wanting to help them. In the meantime, though, Karen had taken a job working at the local Circle K convenience store as a way to save up money to go towards her education. Well, towards her education as well as towards just like the regular costs of living. And Karen really seemed to enjoy this job. She got along well with her coworkers. She got along well with the customers. Karen was just a people person, something I can't relate to. I mean, it's not that I actively dislike people. I'm just like real socially awkward, but that's not why we're here today. So back to Karen. She was a hard worker. She was reliable, and she was the kind of person who was just always willing to lend a helping hand. And that is exactly how she found herself picking up an overnight shift for a coworker starting sometime after 11 p.m. on November 20th, 1988, and ending sometime in the early morning hours of November 21st. Now, to me, this sounds like an absolute nightmare. Because unless I'm filming, your girl's in her jammies and hang out in bed by 9:30. Non-negotiable. That might be because I've got 3 kids absolutely running me ragged through the day, but these overnight shifts were necessary. Circle K was open 24 hours, so someone had to be there to work these graveyard shifts. And typically there were always 2 employees scheduled for these overnight stretches for safety and security purposes. Granted, Vernon Parish was thought to be pretty safe, and no one really worried too terribly much about crime around this time, but it was still possible, obviously. And since Circle K didn't have any security cameras, the least they could do for their employees was to ensure that they were never alone overnight in the store. Unfortunately, though, that happened to be the exact situation that Karen had found herself in on this particular evening. I'm not really sure what the scheduling breakdown there was, but not only did Karen end up working the shift that she wasn't initially scheduled to work, but there also happened to be about an hour and a half that Karen was going to be the only clerk in the store. And it was from about 3 a.m. to 4:30 a.m., I believe. But again, because this woman sounds like a literal angel, she didn't really make a big fuss about it. She always felt safe at work, and she really didn't think it was going to be a big deal. Plus, if all else failed, she knew that she could call her best friend Tammy at any point if she got bored or lonely, scared, or if she just needed someone to talk to. Karen had met Tammy shortly after she'd moved to Leesville, and the two of them had very quickly developed an incredibly strong friendship. It was as if they were meant to be best friends, which is something that luckily I can relate to on a deeply personal level. My best friend and I met under the most random and unlikely circumstances, and we became literally inseparable within what seemed like minutes. We always say that we were meant to be best friends, and I truly believe that. I would trust her with my life. And I very much get the feeling that Karen and Tammy's friendship was the same way. Karen was actually supposed to go to Tammy's house after her shift ended so that she could watch Tammy's kids while she went to the hospital to give birth on the 21st. And the two of them actually ended up spending almost Karen's entire shift on the phone with one another while Tammy packed up her hospital bags and got everything at her house in order for Karen. Whenever necessary, Karen would just lie the phone down if she needed to wait on a customer, but given the hour she was working, I'm sure that they weren't being interrupted too terribly frequently. They were on the phone for, I think, close to 4 hours that evening, from right around when Karen got to work at 11:30ish until about 3:30, 3:40ish in the morning. The only reason they ever ended up getting off the phone was because Tammy decided that she was going to get dressed and drive up to the Circle K to drop some keys off to Karen. Now, I don't really know why she decided to do this, because if Karen was supposed to be coming to her house right after her shift, couldn't she have just given her the keys then. Or maybe Karen was planning on going home first and then heading over, and maybe they were already going to be gone by then. But I don't know who would have had their other kids then. So, well, I guess they could have been at school. I don't know. I don't know. And honestly, it doesn't really matter. Tammy said she was going there to drop off keys. She was going there to drop off keys. The end. However, before Tammy managed to make it up to the Circle K, the store's newspaper delivery man had walked in just before, I think, 4:30 a.m. to a very, very eerie sight. For starters, the cash register was hanging open and was completely empty, which, is never a good sign. And then even more concerning is that despite the presence of her car in the parking lot and her purse in the building, Karen herself was nowhere to be found. It didn't necessarily look like a struggle or anything like that had taken place, but even so, the newspaper delivery guy was still uneasy enough about what he was seeing that he decided he should call 911. Luckily, police did take this call seriously and they dispatched to the Circle K pretty much right away. They ended up getting there right before Tammy did, so she was completely shocked when she finally got to the store. Here she's thinking she's just gonna walk in and hand off keys to her best friend, and instead she's intercepted by police officers telling her that somehow in the 40-ish minutes since she'd last spoken to Karen, her best friend had completely disappeared. I seriously cannot even begin to imagine how hard it must have been for her to wrap her head around that. You always hear, like, for example, if somebody passes away, you always hear people say something along the lines of, like, oh, I just talked to him last week. Like, how could they possibly be gone? But in this situation, Tammy had talked to Karen less than an hour ago. So the fact that she could have basically vanished, it had to be so surreal. She had to feel like she was living in a bad dream, but sadly, it was what was really happening. It was the reality of the situation. And as difficult as I'm sure she knew it was going to be, it was the reality that Tammy knew she now needed to inform Karen's husband of immediately. So she hopped back in her car and she drove straight to James and Karen's house to hand deliver to him the horrific news that his wife very well may have been kidnapped. Because even though no one could say for sure yet what had happened, it definitely seemed as though someone had robbed the store before forcing Karen to leave with them. It just seemed kind of like it was the only realistic explanation for everything. Karen was an incredibly responsible and reliable worker, so the idea that she had left in the middle of her shift on her own volition, no one was buying that. He knew his wife far too well, and he knew that doing anything like this, doing anything that might cause people undue worry, was so far outside of the scope of anything that Karen would ever do willingly. No, he knew right away that something was seriously, seriously wrong. So he threw on some clothes, hopped in his car, and he raced as fast as he could over to the Circle K. Just like Tammy, James was stopped at the door by police, and just as Tammy had, he explained to them that they needed to be out looking for his wife because there was absolutely no way that she would have left that store on her own free will. Thankfully, though, police were already way ahead of him. They'd already set up roadblocks to question passing motorists. They'd already deployed a fairly extensive search team, and they searched high and low, near and far, for hours, hoping to find and rescue Karen Hill. But sadly, around 8:30 that morning, some local hunters discovered Karen's body tied to a tree in some woods about 10 miles away from the Circle K off Highway 10 near a small lake. She had been very clearly shot in the left eye with what would later be determined to be a .22 caliber handgun at very close range. The scene was absolutely horrific. The thought that Karen had been looking down the barrel of the gun as it was discharged and ended her life, it's enough to make you sick to your stomach. And it was actually determined during her autopsy that her eye had been open at the moment the bullet entered it. Not to mention that she had powder burns around her eye, so she had been shot basically at point blank range. I cannot even begin to imagine the complete and total terror she must have felt during her last moments. It's heartbreaking to think about. And if you can even believe it, it gets worse. Because although Karen was completely clothed when she was discovered. In fact, she even still had on her Circle K work smock, but it was ultimately determined during her autopsy that Karen had been sexually violated prior to her death. It was clear to everyone involved that whoever had committed this crime was fucking sick in the head, or according to investigators, cold-blooded, heartless, and monstrous. And Karen's friends, family, and the investigators were far from the only ones deeply affected by this crime. The community in its entirety was on high alert following the discovery of Karen's body. The crime was undoubtedly vicious and heinous, yes, but what made it incredibly scary was the fact that it seemed to be completely random. And I've even said that here before, that crimes like this, that are totally random, are the scariest ones, because those are the ones that quite literally could happen to anyone. The police did chase down a few leads towards the beginning of the case, but ultimately none of them panned out. Oh, and they obviously looked into James, which, even though he knew it was coming because they always look into the husband, it was still a really difficult pill for him to swallow. Not that anyone ever truly felt as though he was to blame. Karen's mom even made the almost 1,000-mile journey to Leesville just to show her support for James. And I don't know why this part of the story stuck with me so much, but at first when James saw Jessie, he was actually upset because he thought that maybe she'd come down because she thought he was responsible, but she quickly set him straight, explaining to him that she hadn't come down out of suspicion, rather that she'd come down out of support because she knew for a fact that he didn't do it. And she was not wrong. They were very quickly able to rule James out as a suspect. Not only did he pass a polygraph test with flying colors, but his DNA also didn't match the DNA that had been collected from Karen's body during her autopsy. And sadly from there, Karen's case went cold. But please don't take that to mean that I am in any way, shape, or form insinuating that people forgot, because they surely did not. But as is the nature with any tragedy, time does move on, and this situation was no exception. For most people in the community, life started to go back to normal for the most part. That is until the following spring of 1989. May, to be exact. 23-year-old Pamela Miller had moved to Leesville from Colorado towards the end of 1988. Now, I can't speak to her exact reasoning for wanting to move 1,200 miles across the country, but I do know that her sister Annette was already living in Leesville, and once Pam got there, she moved in with Annette, and she quickly secured 2 different jobs. One was working at a local Burger King, and one was working at a local cleaner. She'd also started seeing a new guy pretty shortly after she got settled, so I don't know, maybe she just needed a fresh start. And what better way to get a fresh start than to move 18 plus hours away? So fast forward to May 29th, Pam had plans to go out to a local club to see a stand-up comedian, so she got dressed in a mint green blouse, some blue jeans, and some black high heels, and she headed off to the Instant Replay Lounge. And she was there until roughly like 11:30 before she was seen pulling out of the parking lot. And it's then believed that she stopped off at a Lebo's convenience store off of Highway 8 in order to use their payphone. Now, no one's able to say for sure who she may have been trying to contact using that payphone, but it is speculated that she was trying to call Billy Hunt, which is the guy that she'd been casually seeing. The problem was, though, that if she had been trying to call Billy, he was busy. You see, that night, Billy had been in the process of entertaining a different lady friend. Because, you know, he and Pam didn't have plans to see each other that evening, so why not? I do have to imagine, though, that he was pretty surprised when he went to take his visitor home for the evening, and he found Pam's car parked outside of his gate. Now, luckily for Billy, Pam wasn't in her car, so, you know, wasn't going to get busted gallivanting around town with his other lady. But in my humble opinion, shouldn't this have been cause for concern? Because I don't know about you, but I can't think of a good reason that she would have abandoned her car there just outside of his house, straight up blocking his gate. It definitely seems weird to me, but Billy said that he thought that maybe she'd parked it there because she'd been having car trouble and maybe she'd just had one of her friends come and pick her up. But in my mind, and feel free to let me know if you disagree, But if she was having car trouble and she was right outside of her boyfriend's house, wouldn't it have made more sense for her to go up there and ask him for help instead of having one of her friends follow her all the way to his house so that she could block his gate by parking her car there so that her friend could I don't know, it's definitely weird to me. But I guess initially Billy didn't really think much of it. However, when it was still there in the morning and upon further inspection, Billy noticed that Pam had left her purse lying on the front seat. That is when Billy started to wonder if maybe something was going on here that wasn't great. Pam was reported missing later that same day, and once the Vernon Parish Sheriff's Office made it out to the scene, they quickly determined that Pam had likely been abducted when she'd gotten out of her car to open Billy's gate to his house. I guess one of the reasons that they came to this conclusion so quickly was that Pam's high heel shoe prints in the dirt appeared to be surrounded by larger, assumably male footprints. So just like they had with Karen, police immediately deployed an extensive search team while investigators made their rounds questioning Pam's family and friends and coworkers. Sadly though, one by one, they were ruling people out until finally their pool of leads had almost completely dried up. And from there, Pam's case, much like Karen's, grew cold. And for the next 6 months, there was little to no movement on her case. However, in November of 1989, almost exactly 6 months after she disappeared, there was an incredibly devastating development. It was Friday, November 24th, when a couple of hunters discovered what they believed to be human skeletal remains in a shallow grave located in the woods on Peason Ridge. Now, Peason Ridge is a wildlife management area that's located just north of the Fort Polk main post. It's typically an area of land that's open to the public for hunting and fishing, boating, and other outdoor recreation. But sometimes it is shut down in order to be utilized by local military personnel for training. And coincidentally, the last time that had happened was throughout March and April of that year. So right before Pam had gone missing. Pretty much right after the body was discovered, the Vernon Parish Sheriff's Office sought some assistance from the FBI. Well, they dug up the gravesite and searched for additional evidence to help guide their investigation. The skeletal remains were sent to the FBI lab in DC for identification. Sadly, though, because the remains had been left out in the Louisiana heat throughout the hottest part of the year, well, they weren't exactly in the best shape. Let's just say that. It was completely impossible for a definitive cause of death to be determined. And as far as making a positive identification, well, that would be possible, but it certainly would not be easy, nor would it be quick. It took 3 weeks for the FBI lab to positively identify the remains using dental records. And sadly, just before Christmas in 1989, the skeletal remains found buried at Peason Ridge were confirmed to be those of Pamela Miller. What was really frustrating for police was that even though they'd managed to collect some small bits of evidence from the gravesite, they still had absolutely no leads. They had persons of interest, sure, but they were all being ruled out pretty quickly. So even with the discovery of Pam's body, they were no closer to finding out what had happened to her, or more importantly, who was responsible. They did theorize that perhaps they were looking for someone who was familiar with the Peason Ridge area, given how remote and secluded Pam's gravesite had been. And they even wondered if maybe they were looking for someone that was stationed at Fort Polk, because it just seemed really coincidental to them that the time frame in which Pam had been abducted and dumped there just so happened to coincide almost perfectly with when the military training in the area had ended. It was almost as if whomever was responsible for what had happened to Pam had known the area well and also had known that she likely wouldn't be found quickly if she was left there. And while that theory does make a lot of sense, it's still just a theory. And even with these theories, they still weren't really making any headway in the investigation. And understandably, this was really unsettling for the residents of Leesville. Murders were not a common occurrence in that area by any means. But when they had happened in the past, they'd always been wrapped up pretty quickly and fairly easily. So the fact that whomever was responsible for Karen Hill's death and for Pamela Miller's death, whether they were the same person or not, the fact that the responsible parties had not been caught yet led to a lot of pressure from the public onto the police. People wanted these crimes solved. They wanted a resolution, and they wanted to feel safe in their community again. These cases were so exhausting and so frustrating to the investigators because they too wanted nothing more than to figure out who this sicko was that was just plucking young women off the street and murdering them without a care in the world. They too wanted justice for these women, and more than anything, they wanted to get this person or people off the street before they struck again. But even after hundreds of hours of diligent investigating, just like Karen Hill's case had before hers, Pamela Miller's case also went cold. And just as they'd been before, residents of Leesville were once again forced to the best of their ability, resume their normal lives. But this time around, they would not get nearly the reprieve they had between Karen and Pam, because the next tragedy was looming just around the corner. Tammy Michelle Call was born on September 29th, 1974, in North Carolina to her parents, Joe and Reba Call. Tammy was one of, I believe, 4 children. I think she had 1 brother and 2 sisters, if I'm not mistaken. From my understanding, the Calls lived in North Carolina until Tammy was in her early teens. However, sometime in the late 80s, they relocated to Leesville for Joe's job. And that is how her story has come to be so closely connected to that of Karen and Pam. The Calls were a close-knit, loving, and happy family. And Tammy specifically was incredibly sweet and loving and kind. At this point in our story, early 1990, Tammy seemed to be adjusting well to her new life in Louisiana. She was making friends, she enjoyed her classes, and she had a great relationship with her parents. She just seemed to be an overall happy person. Tuesday, February 20th, 1990, started out like any other day in recent memory had for the Call family. The only thing out of the ordinary was that Tammy had woken up a little late. Therefore, she was rushing around to get ready and to get out of the house on time to catch the bus with her brother and sisters. And her mom says that she can distinctly remember Tammy trying to like wolf down a bowl of cereal as fast as she could before she ran out of the house and jumped onto the bus with her siblings. And as silly as it was, Reba had no idea just how closely she would hold that memory because, unbeknownst to her, that moment would be the last time that she ever saw her daughter. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break and throw on my lashes. Don't go nowhere. All right, so Tammy's bus arrived at school with the kids unloading just before the start of first period. However, Tammy would not be present in first period or any of her classes that day because Tammy and one of her friends had decided to ditch school that day, which who hasn't? I can say for sure that my high school attendance was abysmal, especially my senior year once I turned 18. Woohoo! I skipped so much school. I'm pretty sure I was actually only a few days shy of missing so much school that I couldn't graduate. I missed so much school that my senior superlative was most likely to be late to graduation. And while I have to admit that was funny, it was a real downgrade from my middle school superlative of best smile. Ooh, you know what? That's fun. Leave down in the comments what you were voted as for your school superlative, if your school had that. I think most schools have them, but also I have no idea outside my own school. So yeah, let me know. Anyways, so yeah, as all of the other Leesville high school students funneled into the building, down the halls, and to their respective classrooms, Tammy and her friend quietly snuck away, heading towards the back of the school where Tammy's friend's boyfriend was waiting to pick them up. Unfortunately, though, for the girls, their plan was thwarted by a rogue educator. Basically, what happened was a teacher was walking back towards the school from the parking lot. I guess she'd gone down to get something she left in her car. And this just so happened to be at the exact time that Tammy and her friend were trying to go AWOL. Obviously, seeing this, the teacher was like, yeah, I don't think so, ladies. Let's throw it in reverse and head back to class before you're late. Now, Tammy accepted defeat. She did as the teacher asked, and she turned around and made her way back into the school. However, her friend, knowing that her boyfriend was just a couple of yards away, waiting for her, she thought quick on her feet, and she told the teacher that she too needed to run to her car so that she could grab some books that she'd forgotten that morning. And okay, So the teacher believed her and she sent her on her way. But I'm genuinely curious to know, is that what your guys' teachers at your schools would have done? I guess it depends on the teacher if I'm thinking back to my high school. I feel like some of them might have believed that and just let you go, trusting that you'd come back. But I feel like there were definitely some that would have stood and waited at the top of the parking lot steps for me to come back with the books as proof. Make sure I wasn't lying. But that also could have been because of my aforementioned attendance issues. So Tammy's friend manages to make it down to her boyfriend's car. She hops in, and from my understanding, they go ahead and take off. I imagine she figured that Tammy wasn't going to be skipping class with them anymore, and given the fact that she'd barely managed to make it out, I assume she probably wasn't really trying to hang around the premises too much longer. But what's unfortunate about that is that Tammy did still plan on skipping class that day, and she'd actually managed to sneak back out of the school almost immediately after her and her friend had been confronted by that teacher. And what is super frustrating is that had this happened present day, these kids would have undoubtedly had cell phones to communicate with one another. And if that were the case, this story likely would have turned out a whole lot differently. But alas, we're talking about a time much before cell phones were common or even popular. So Tammy had no way to contact her friend. No way to let her know, like, hey, I'll meet you up the street. No way to contact her and say, hey, I got out. Come back and get me. No way for her friend to get a hold of her and let her know that she was just going to go ahead and leave. So when she got out, only to realize that there in fact was not a car waiting to take her out on a nice little ditch day, she did what I assume any teenager at that time would have done in that situation. She started walking. And there's no conclusive way to know exactly where Tammy went that day or exactly what she did. However, one student whom she rode the bus with later came forward claiming that he'd seen Tammy that day in front of the Berrytown shopping center. I guess this kid had missed the bus and his mom was driving him into school late, and that's when he happened to notice Tammy walking. She was walking southbound along Highway 171. But beyond that, no one knows exactly what happened to Tammy Call once she left school that day. Joe and Reba had absolutely no idea at any point that day that their daughter was anywhere other than safely tucked in a desk in one of her classrooms. It wasn't until they didn't see Tammy get off the bus that afternoon that they realized that something was wrong. And it didn't take them but a few seconds to spring into action. They did not wait around. They knew right away that something wasn't right, and they wasted absolutely no time. Right away, Joe and Reba called the police and tried to report Tammy missing. However, they were initially told that they'd need to wait 24 hours before the police could do anything. And we all know this rhetoric. We've heard it a million different times in a million different cases. Apparently, one of the officers even went so far as to tell Joe that there was probably nothing to worry about because kids just did this sort of thing sometimes. To which Joe responded that, that's great and all, but not his kid. And honestly, good for Joe, because it frustrates me so much when officers in these stories don't take parents' word when it comes to what their kid would or wouldn't do. And I'm not naive. I know that more often than not, parents don't know everything about their kids, but I'd be willing to bet that they definitely know more than these random cops do. And okay, let's think about this objectively. Say that a child does run away. We're still potentially talking about a minor out without supervision, out without permission, out without transportation. To me, that still sounds like a situation that could easily become dangerous pretty quickly, especially if happening in a city where 2 additional young girls had already been abducted and murdered. But I don't know, even without that factor, I still think that any time a minor isn't where they're supposed to be and the parents are concerned enough to get the police involved, I think it should be taken seriously and not just pushed aside as just another runaway, because at that point, you're potentially just wasting valuable time. But let me dismount from my soapbox and carry on with the story. Now, I'm not sure exactly how long it took police to actually start looking into Tammy's disappearance, but at some point they did deploy search efforts throughout the school and throughout the surrounding area. Kinda. However, sadly, these searches yielded little to no information for police to begin their investigation with. Meanwhile, Tammy's friends and family were out boots to the ground, searching high and low in hopes of tracking her down and bringing her home safely. Joe, in particular, seemed incapable of being idle throughout the first few weeks of Tammy's disappearance. He spent seemingly every waking moment out driving around and searching for her, and not just in Leesville, but he also went out and searched most of the surrounding communities as well. Conversely, though, Reba refused to leave the house, or more specifically, to leave the phone. And I feel like I can kind of relate to this. I mean, obviously we have cell phones now, so we'd be able to do both, but I can definitely almost feel her desperation to be sitting right there, to be right by the phone so that if and when an update came in, there would be absolutely no chance that you would miss it. It is heart-wrenching to think about, and honestly, as a mother, it makes me sick to my stomach to think of the absolute emotional torment both Joe and Reba must have been experiencing. The thought of simply just not knowing, I mean, it has to be enough to almost drive you crazy. Oh, and of course, as I feel like always seems to happen in these stories, the Call family did receive a decent amount of prank calls claiming to know where Tammy was or to know what had happened to her. And can I just say that if you are someone that would do something like this, or someone that doesn't see the massive fucking problem with doing something like this, please seek help. Seriously, get a fucking grip on your life, bro. Because if you feel like it's acceptable or comical to do something like that to a family that is going through quite literally one of the most horrific and devastating experiences possible, something has to be seriously dysfunctional in your brain. You rancid pile of human shit. Anyways, it wasn't until about a month after Tammy's disappearance that really any developments were made or any trace of her was found. It was March 30th, so just over a month since she was last seen, that Tammy's backpack was discovered in some weeds and tall grass along a path located behind the high school. And to the best of my knowledge, it wasn't really discovered all that far from the school, which, in my opinion, really calls into question just how extensive the initial police search effort really was. Obviously, I wasn't there, so I don't know for sure, but it seems wild to me that they could have missed this during their preliminary searches. Police claim they missed this because they didn't think it was likely that Tammy would have traveled that path once she'd left the school, but they also said that they'd searched the school and surrounding area. So, did you search the school and surrounding areas? Or did you cherry pick where you searched based off of your personal opinions as to how Tammy's morning may or may not have played out? Maybe I'm being too critical, but in my opinion, it's ludicrous that they would write something so basic off because they deemed it as being unlikely. Sure, maybe Tammy wouldn't have made the choice to travel that path on her own free will, but I'm pretty sure we're looking for a girl who's assumed to have been abducted. So why are we tailoring our search efforts around what we believe she would or wouldn't have done on her own volition? Am I interpreting something wrong? Am I not understanding something properly? Because the fact that they missed this backpack initially does not sit right with me. But regardless of my own personal beef with police over this, even having the backpack in their possession didn't really yield any additional information. And for the next 7 years, that's where things sat. Tammy was missing and presumed abducted, with her family left to live in limbo, wondering and agonizing over what may have happened to her. That said, I truly have to hand it to her family. It seems like they never took a moment to rest when it came to keeping Tammy's name in the spotlight. They spoke to newspapers, they spoke to tons of other media forums, they made multiple appearances on their local news, they created missing posters, they spoke to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Anything you can think of that someone could or should do in their situation, the calls did it. But sadly, they would still have to live without answers for close to a decade, because it wasn't until January of 1997 that any further movement was made in Tammy's case. And just like in Pam and Karen's cases, It was all thanks to an unsuspecting hunter. This hunter was walking through a remote area of the Kisatchie National Forest when he discovered what he believed to be part of a human skull. And upon making this, I'm sure, chilling discovery, the hunter called the police and reported what he'd found. They made their way out to the area immediately, and during a preliminary search, they discovered some additional teeth as well as a shoe. And I don't personally think I have ever heard of an investigator doing this in a case, but in a very unprecedented move, Officer Larry Smith actually brought Tammy's dad out to the area where the remains had been discovered. And even though it would take 10 months of official testing to say for sure, Joe said that once he saw that shoe, he knew. He knew the remains belonged to Tammy because he knew those shoes. He remembered buying them. Still, the recovered remains were sent to the anthropology department at Louisiana State University, where they determined that the remains were that of a female in her mid-teens to early 20s. From there, they were sent to a pathology lab where, upon comparison to the DNA provided by Joe and Reba, they were in fact determined to be those of 15-year-old Tammy Michelle Call. Sadly, given the fact that her remains had been subject to the elements as well as wildlife interference, no cause of death was able to definitively be determined. However, her manner of death was determined to be homicide, but beyond that, there still, after all this time, was not much else to go on. And devastatingly, Tammy's case, just like Pam's and just like Karen's, began to go cold. But just as frustrations mounted in Tammy's case, a breakthrough seemed to come in Karen's. It was 1996, so 8 years after Karen had initially been murdered, when her mother, Jessie McWilliams, received a phone call that she never in 1 million years could have expected. It was a very brief phone call in which the caller identified himself as Angel before dropping a massive bombshell on Jessie. He told her that he knew who had killed her daughter, and he promised that he was going to contact the police and set them straight. He also told her that he was sorry and that he wanted to make things right because no mother deserved to go through the anguish that she'd been living through every day for close to a decade. And that was it. He didn't tell her who the supposed killer was, how he knew them, who he was, nothing. Just, I know who did it. I'm going to help police find him. Click. Now, obviously I can't say for sure, but I have to imagine that if I was Jessie, I would have put little to no stock in this phone call, especially given how vague and out of the blue it was. I probably would have written it off completely. But the caller was very much serious, and he very much did intend on setting police on a path to solving Karen's case. Samuel Kenneth Galbraith was a 19-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Polk at the time of Karen's abduction and murder. Actually, he was stationed there from January 1988 to June 1990. So his service time frame directly corresponds with the timing of all of the cases we've covered today, but we'll get more into that in a minute. Now, had Sammy Boy done just a few key things differently, there's a good chance he probably never would have ended up on police's radar regarding Karen. Therefore, he likely would have gotten away with murder. But because he's an idiot, he thought it would be a good idea to bump his gums to his roommate about a very dark, depraved, disturbing little fantasy he had. Specifically, Sam detailed to his roommate that he had a nagging desire to someday abduct a woman from a convenience store. He wanted to abduct her and then take her to a secluded area where he would rape and murder her. And if not speaking up about this wasn't bad enough, allegedly Sam had also confessed to this guy what he'd done after he'd done it. So stupid.
You can kill somebody, you can't lie for 10 fucking minutes about it?
Anyways, so the reason that all of this sort of came to light all this time later, I guess there was some kind of reunion at Fort Polk with a bunch of the former soldiers. And during this soiree, Angel and Sam's old roommate got to talking and, bing, bang, boom. I'm sure you can connect the dots from there. And as soon as Angel got off the phone with Karen's mom, just as he promised, he called the Vernon Parish Sheriff's Office and he told them everything he knew. And whoo, did this information seem to reignite a flame under investigators. They ended up traveling over like half the country, from Louisiana to New York, Rhode Island to Ohio, all in an effort to obtain as much information and to speak with as many people with connections to Sam as possible. At this point in time, Sam had retired from the Army and he was living in Aransas Pass, Texas. And he was fully cooperative when local police showed up at his door and asked him to accompany them down to the station for a chat. So cooperative, in fact, that he didn't even ask them why they needed to talk to him. He just slipped on his little shoes and headed out the door. He even managed to keep his composure when confronted with the information they'd received from his former roommate. He wasn't fazed at all, just cool as a cucumber. Yeah, it wasn't until they whipped out that little cotton swab and asked to swab his cheek that Sam was like, well, hold on now. But it didn't matter because he had absolutely no say in whether or not he was going to hand over his DNA because they had already obtained a warrant to collect it one way or another. So yeah, that's when his cool guy demeanor fell away and his confidence began to waver. Now, I'm sure it'll come as absolutely no surprise to you, but Sam's DNA was an exact match to the DNA that had been recovered from Karen Hill's crime scene. But what I do think might blow your fucking socks off is that after just a week in custody, Sam was released on a $50,000 bond with, get this, no restrictions. As in, if he wanted to travel, leave the state, go for it. Be free, little butterfly. And rightfully so, Louisiana was pissed. They were smack dab in the middle of initiating the extradition process. What were they supposed to do if Sam just decided to dip out and disappear? It's reasons like this that our legal system truly never ceases to baffle the ever-loving shit out of me. Thankfully, though, Sam's lawyer advised him not to force the whole extradition process and to instead go to Louisiana and turn himself in voluntarily. My guess is that she figured it'd be easier to defend him if he did that, rather than if he tried to slip away in the middle of the night. Sam's trial was set to begin in Y2K. However, before it got started, he was offered and subsequently accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to manslaughter and attempted first-degree rape. Supposedly, he was offered this deal after it was discovered that critical DNA evidence had either been lost or mishandled over the years. So they offered him this deal to avoid the chance at the defense requesting their own testing on said DNA. And without that DNA evidence, their case would have been weakly circumstantial. And Sam accepted the deal because it guaranteed that he would not receive the death penalty. Rather, he was sentenced to 71 years with a chance of parole after 20 years, thanks to Louisiana's 2045 law. Basically, this law allows anyone that is sentenced to more than 30 years a chance to go before a parole board after they've served 20 years, as long as they are 45 years old or older. So this made Sam eligible for parole in 2017, which obviously he applied for. He put in his request at the first chance he got, citing his dedicated involvement to prison programs and his nearly spotless record while behind bars. And believe it or not, on November 3rd, 2016, the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Parole voted unanimously to grant Samuel Galbraith parole. I think his parole term was 15 years, meaning he would have been a completely free man come spring of 2032. He was given a tentative release date of April 24th, 2017, as well as the conditions that he could not return to Louisiana, nor could he contact anyone in Karen's family. And with that, he was sent back to his cell, probably just kicking his little heels together with excitement. However, Karen Hill's family, they were not excited. Quite the contrary. They were pissed. Not only had they not been informed of the hearing, meaning they weren't given the chance to attend and speak their piece, but this monster had brutally and viciously raped and murdered their wife, their daughter, their sister, and he was going to get out after serving less than a third of his sentence. It just did not seem fair to them. It didn't seem adequate, and frankly, it didn't seem right. And they were not planning to keep quiet about it. They took their grievances straight to the media, and upon hearing of Sam's pending release, the community went absolutely ba-fucking-nanas. There was a massive uproar and a very large public objection to Sam's parole. And after being positively inundated with complaints and just general outrage, on April 21st, 2017, so just 3 days before he was scheduled to be released, Sam's parole was rescinded.
Isn't that sad?
Well, he thought so. So he tried to sue Louisiana, claiming that he was being used as a political football, that his parole had become a major tool for the opponents of Governor John Bell Edwards' criminal justice reform proposals. Well, you know what, Sam? I think you're a major tool. Furthermore, he stated that he had only been told that his parole could be taken away if he engaged in any misconduct while still in custody. That his parole shouldn't be rescinded because he was just all set up for his life on the outside. He was gonna move back to Texas with his wife and his mom, and he was gonna get a job working at his family's construction business. And I'm sorry, but boo frickin' who? Nobody cares that your stupid post-prison plans were put on hold. Homie, you killed a woman. She never got to live out any of the plans she had for her life. So to sit here and listen to you bellyache over the injustice you think you experienced, give me a fucking break. I think Vernon Parish District Attorney Asa Skinner said it the best. Just because you apply for parole doesn't mean you're gonna get it. So suck it up, pal. Well, DA Skinner said the first part. I ad-libbed the suck it up part, so. Sam applied for parole again in 2020, this time being denied 2-1, but he did finally offer up an apology to Karen's family at this hearing, but honestly, in my opinion, it's too little too late. So, as of right now, 53-year-old Samuel Kenneth Galbraith remains incarcerated at the Elaine Hunt Correctional Center located in St. Gabriel, Louisiana. Since his incarceration, the Vernon Parish Sheriff's Department has worked diligently to determine whether or not Sam could be responsible for Pam and Tammy's deaths, as well as Karen's. Leesville never had a case like any of those three before Sam was stationed at Fort Polk, nor did they see anything similar once his time at Fort Polk ended. Obviously, that could just be a coincidence, but it definitely raises an eyebrow. Some of the people involved don't think that there's a connection between the cases, while others, like Kenneth Williams, believe that Samuel Galbraith should be viewed not as a person of interest in the murders of Tammy Call and Pamela Miller, but as a suspect. However, Sam has refused to speak to authorities about any potential involvement in Tammy or Pam's murders. In 2018, Sheriff Sam Kraft put together a special cold case investigation team in order to reopen both cases and conduct new investigations in a renewed effort to find each woman's killer. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of recent information regarding where Pam's case stands. However, there has been a decent amount of movement in more recent years regarding Tammy's case. The VPSO cold case team re-interviewed a lot of the original witnesses in the case, hoping to maybe develop some new leads. And in September of 2021, VPSO detectives, Fort Polk CID agents, and U.S. Army personnel conducted an extensive excavation of the area that Tammy's remains were found. They did this in hopes that they may be able to recover any additional remains or evidence that was possibly overlooked back in '97. As far as I could find, Tammy's parents, Reba and Joe Call, still live in the same house in Vernon Parish, and they still hold out hope that someday they'll see a resolution to her case, that someday they will see justice for their little girl. And as much as I wish it wasn't, that's basically where everything rests at this point in time. Rest in peace to all three of these women. They deserved so much more out of life, and it is devastating that their time here was cut so short and in such an awful and terrifying way. If they were still here with us today, Karen would be 56, Pam would be 57, and Tammy would be 49. And man, it is just hard to wrap your mind around how much they could have done and how much they could have experienced. I truly wish I had so much more information about all these girls to give you. I really do. But I honestly think that I included everything that's out there. I just feel so bad for all of these families left reeling from these tragedies. I mean, poor Tammy and Pam's families having to live all of this time without a concrete resolution and with the possibility that they may never get one. And Karen's family, well, yes, they got a resolution, but now they have to go through the rest of their lives knowing exactly the horror that she experienced in her last moments alive. I don't know, it's awful any way you slice it, and I hope more than anything that the families have been able to find some peace and some healing over these difficult years. No one deserves to live with that type of anguish and that type of grief. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. I'm especially interested to hear what you think about Sam. Do you think he was responsible for Tammy and Pam's deaths? As far as my opinion goes, obviously I can't say for sure, but I definitely think that there's a more compelling argument for yes than there is for no, but I'm definitely interested to hear what you guys think. Thank you so much again to Sarah for bringing these cases to my attention. I think it is so important to keep cases like this relevant and to keep talking about them. On the off chance that you have any information regarding Pamela Miller or Tammy Call's suspicious deaths, please reach out to the Vernon Parish Sheriff's Office at 337-238-7248. No tip is too small, so if you think you know something, please don't hesitate to reach out because you never know what bit of information they could need to break these cases open. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked in the description box. And while you're lurking around down there, if you have any interest in the makeup I used today, you'll find that information down there as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week, and if you turn on your post notifications, you'll be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. Still looking for spiders. Wah, wah, wah. Yeah, oh my god. Granted, Vernon. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. Are we kidding with this? What in the fuck am I saying? Yeah, it's gonna be fine. They can't all be winners. Oh, my foot's asleep. What is going on my face?